The morning Hazel Hale walked into the dusty little town of Redrock Flats with nothing but a leather satchel, a dead husband's name, and a fire burning behind her green eyes. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and watched her pass. She did not notice, or perhaps she did not care. She had more important things on her mind than the stares of idle men. Redrock Flats sat in the basin of the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1883, a raw and unfinished place where the wind tasted of red dirt, and the buildings along Main Street looked as though they had been nailed together in an afternoon, and had been threatening to fall apart ever since. The saloon was the largest structure in town. The church was the smallest. That told you everything you needed to know about Redrock Flats. Hazel was 28 years old, tall and lean from years of hard ranch work, with dark auburn hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat and calluses on both hands that she did not bother to hide. She had been a widow for 4 months. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had died of fever in June, leaving behind 40 acres of decent grazing land, a small herd of cattle, a modest house, and a debt to a man named Arlo Finch that Thomas had never mentioned to Hazel in all their 6 years of marriage. She had discovered the debt the same week she buried Thomas. A paper appeared at her door, delivered by one of Finch's hired hands, a thin man with dead eyes named Cutter who smiled in a way that did not reach his face at all. The paper claimed Thomas owed Arlo Finch the sum of $820, and that if the sum was not paid within 60 days, the property would pass to Finch as collateral on the loan. Hazel had read that paper 3 times at her kitchen table with a candle burning low beside her. Then she had folded it carefully and placed it in the leather satchel she now carried across Main Street in Redrock Flats. She had spent 4 months trying to solve this problem quietly. She had written to the county office. She had ridden to the nearest town with a lawyer, a man named Pelham who had squinted at the paper and then at her, and told her that without the original loan agreement, there was very little he could do, and that Finch's paper appeared, on its face, to be legitimate. She had asked neighbors who had known Thomas, and none of them had ever heard Thomas mention borrowing money from Arlo Finch. She had searched every drawer and box and floorboard in the house for any record of this debt and found nothing. What she had found, tucked inside Thomas's old Bible in the back of his wardrobe, was a folded letter. The letter was not about any debt. It was a letter Thomas had written but never sent, addressed to a man named Henry Rourke, and it spoke about something that made Hazel sit down on the edge of the bed and read very slowly. The letter described a dispute. 6 years before Thomas died, before he and Hazel had even married, Thomas had been involved in a land disagreement with Arlo Finch. Finch had wanted a strip of land along the eastern creek line of what was now the Hale property, claiming an old survey had misdrawn the boundary. Thomas had refused to cede the land. Finch had backed off at the time, but Thomas had written to Henry Rourke, who had apparently witnessed the original survey and could confirm where the true boundary lay. Thomas had written the letter but never sent it, perhaps because the issue had seemed resolved, perhaps because he had never imagined it would resurface. The letter gave Hazel a name, Henry Rourke. She had asked around about him. What she learned was that he was a ranch hand who had drifted through the territory for years, working various spreads, a man known to be honest and capable and not particularly given to trouble. The most recent information she had placed him at a cattle operation about 30 miles east of Redrock Flats, a place called the Crescent Bar Ranch. She had written to the Crescent Bar. No reply came. And so when she learned that a traveling circuit judge named Clarence Aldgate was due to arrive in Redrock Flats on the 2nd Tuesday of October to hold court and hear disputes in the surrounding region, Hazel Hale packed her satchel and made the 16-mile ride to town on her buckskin mare, and decided that if the law was going to pass through this part of the territory, she was going to stand in front of it and speak. The hearing was scheduled for the Thursday after the judge's arrival. Arlo Finch had apparently already filed his case with the circuit court, which meant Hazel had 2 days to prepare and, ideally, to find Henry Rourke. She took a room at the Redrock Flats boarding house, a narrow building run by a stout woman named Mrs. Pierce who asked no questions and provided coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Hazel set her satchel on the narrow bed, sat beside it, and looked at the water-stained ceiling and tried to decide if she was frightened or simply exhausted. She concluded it was both, which somehow felt more manageable than either one alone. She went to find the judge the following morning. He was staying at the hotel, which was marginally better than the boarding house, and he received her in the small front parlor that doubled as his temporary office. Judge Clarence Aldgate was a compact man in his 60s, with white side whiskers and small glasses that he wore low on his nose and peered over constantly. He had the brisk, efficient manner of a man who had spent 30 years moving from town to town with a gavel and a stack of case files, and had heard more human misery than he cared to count. He listened to Hazel with his hands folded on the table and his eyes attentive. "Mrs. Hale," he said when she had finished laying out the basics, "you're saying this debt your husband allegedly owed to Mr. Finch is fabricated." "I'm saying I have no evidence it exists and considerable reason to believe it does not," Hazel said. "I have lived alongside Thomas Hale for 6 years and I know his business. He was not a man who borrowed money without telling me. We kept our accounts together. And the paper Mr. Finch holds, I believe it to be false. Drawn up after Thomas's death when Thomas could not dispute it." The judge looked at her over his glasses for a long moment. "That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Hale. It is a serious situation, Your Honor." He nodded slowly. "You mentioned a witness, a man named Rourke who can speak to a prior land dispute with Finch. If I can find him before Thursday, yes." "Find him," the judge said simply. "Because without corroborating testimony, you are asking me to overturn a signed document based on a widow's word against an established landowner. Courts are not unsympathetic to widows, Mrs. Hale, but they require evidence." She left the hotel and walked back into the bright October morning, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. She had 1 day to find a man who might not even be in the territory anymore. She had a letter her dead husband had written but never sent. She had her own memory of 6 years of honest marriage. And she had, at the bottom of her satchel beneath the folded legal papers, 40 acres of land that her husband had built from nothing, and that she had every intention of keeping. The saloon seemed like the most logical place to ask about a traveling ranch hand, so she pushed through the doors at mid-morning without particular ceremony, enduring the startled looks of the half-dozen men at the bar and the tables. The bartender, a large man with a red beard named Pete, recovered quickly from his surprise and leaned on the bar with an expression that was more curious than hostile. "Rourke," he repeated when she asked. "Henry Rourke. That name does ring a bell. Do you know where he is?" Pete scratched his chin. "Heard he was working the Crescent Bar, but I also heard the Crescent Bar let some men go about a month back when the season turned. Could be he's drifting. Could he be in town? Could be. Men drift through here all the time. I'd ask over at the livery. Clyde over there, he knows most of the horses in the territory and who's riding them." Hazel thanked him and went to the livery. Clyde was a wiry, sunburned man of about 50 who smelled permanently of horse and hay, and who turned out to be a genuine wellspring of information about who had passed through Redrock Flats in recent weeks. "Rourke," he said thoughtfully, combing through a pony's mane as he talked. "Tall fellow, brown hair, got a scar on his left jaw from a branding iron accident years back. I don't know what he looks like," Hazel admitted. "Well, if that's the Rourke I'm thinking of, he rode in 3 days ago on a gray horse. Appaloosa gray, real nice animal. He's been camped outside of town, I think. Saw him buying grain and provisions over at Hanson's store yesterday morning." Hazel's heart lifted. "He's here. He's still in town. Far as I know, haven't seen him ride out." She found him an hour later. She had walked the perimeter of town methodically, checking the spots where a man camping alone might set up, and she found his camp on the north side of the creek that ran behind the town, maybe a 1/4 mile from the nearest building. There was a small fire, a bedroll, a canvas lean-to strung between two cottonwood trees, and a gray Appaloosa horse picketed on a long line, grazing on the creek bank grass. And there was a man sitting on a flat rock with his back to her, mending the leather of a bridle with careful, practiced hands. "Henry Rourke," she called out, keeping a respectful distance. He turned. She had not known what to expect, and she recognized that she had built some vague image in her mind during the weeks of searching for him, probably something like the dependable older ranch hand she had imagined from Thomas's letter. The man who turned to look at her was not that. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with a lean, weathered face and dark brown eyes that were alert and intelligent, and held a kind of quiet watchfulness that she associated with men who spent a great deal of time alone in open country. He had a jaw that was strong and slightly unshaven, and yes, there was a small white scar along the left side of it, just as Clyde had described, roughly the size of a coin. He was dressed practically, worn denim trousers and a canvas shirt and a hat that had seen considerable weather, and his hands were large and capable-looking. He was, she noticed with a kind of involuntary awareness that she immediately set aside as irrelevant, a very good-looking man. He looked at her with those quiet dark eyes and said, "Who are you?" "My name is Hazel Hale. My husband was Thomas Hale. He knew you, I believe, or knew of you some years ago in connection with a land survey dispute with a man named Arlo Finch." Something moved in his expression, an alertness, a sharpening of attention. He set the bridle down carefully on the rock beside him. "Thomas Hale," he said slowly. "Yes, I remember Thomas Hale. I haven't seen him in 6 years. How is he?" "He passed away in June," Hazel said. "Fever." Henry Rourke was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat and held it for a moment, a gesture that struck her as genuinely respectful rather than performed. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "He was a decent man." "He was," Hazel agreed, and she was surprised at how much the simple act of someone else saying it out loud loosened something in her chest. "Mr. Rourke, I have a problem, and I believe you may be the only person in this territory who can help me solve it. May I sit down and explain?" He gestured to a second flat rock near the fire, and she sat and she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes steady on her face as she spoke. She told him about the debt paper, about Finch's claim, about Thomas's unsent letter, about the circuit court hearing on Thursday. She showed him the letter from Thomas's Bible, and he read it without expression and then handed it back. "That's Thomas's handwriting," he said. "I saw enough of it when we worked together briefly on the McCaffrey Ranch in '77. And yes, I was there for that survey. I remember it clearly. Finch wanted that creek land badly enough that he hired a man to restake the markers one night. Thomas and I found the new stakes the next morning. We pulled them and reported it to the county surveyor. The boundary was confirmed where the original plat had it. Finch backed down. Would you be willing to testify to that before a circuit judge?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she met his gaze without flinching because she did not have the luxury of flinching. "Yes," he said, "I'll testify." The relief that moved through her was so physical that she had to press her hands flat on her knees to steady herself. "Thank you," she said, and she heard the rawness in her own voice and did not apologize for it. "When is the hearing?" "Thursday morning. Judge Aldgate." "Aldgate," Henry repeated, nodding. "He's fair. I've been in a courtroom with him once before, years back. He's a straight-dealing man." "That's good to hear." She stood, tucking the letter back into her satchel. "I'm staying at Mrs. Pierce's boarding house on Elm Street if you need to reach me before Thursday. And Mr. Rourke, I want you to know that I intend to pay you for your time." He shook his head once, a small definitive motion. "No need for that. You're giving up days of your time. Thomas Hale once stood between me and a bad situation without being asked," Henry said quietly. "I never got the chance to repay him. Maybe this is it." She did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded. She thanked him again and walked back toward town with the October sun warm on her back, and the cottonwood leaves rattling in the dry wind and something inside her chest feeling, for the first time in 4 months, like it might be all right. She did not sleep particularly well that night. She lay on the narrow bed at Mrs. Pierce's, listening to the sounds of the town settle into the dark, the distant piano from the saloon, a dog barking somewhere on the south end of Main Street, the wind moving around the eaves of the building. She thought about Thomas, not with the acute grief of the early months, but with something softer and sadder, a kind of fond mourning for a good man who had not deserved to go so young. And she thought, briefly and without meaning to, about Henry Rourke's dark eyes, and the way he had said Thomas was a decent man with such simple conviction. She put that thought away and went back to thinking about the case. The next day she spent making sure everything was in order. She brought her papers to Judge Aldgate's temporary office and went over each document with him carefully. The judge listened and took notes in a small leather-bound book and asked precise questions. He told her that Arlo Finch had brought his own legal counsel, a lawyer named Westerbrook who had ridden in from the county seat, and that Finch had several witnesses of his own prepared to testify to the legitimacy of the debt. This worried her more than she let on to the judge. She left his office and walked along the edge of town toward the creek, not heading toward Henry's camp specifically, but finding herself, nonetheless, standing within sight of the cottonwood trees. He was there. He had his horse out on a longer line and was brushing the gray animal down with long, steady strokes. He saw her and lifted a hand in greeting. She walked over. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Finch has a lawyer and multiple witnesses," she said. "He would," Henry said calmly, returning the brush to the gray Appaloosa's flank. "Finch has always been a man who prepares for a fight before he picks it. Does that concern you?" He considered this honestly. "It depends on what his witnesses say. If they're lying, a good judge can usually tell. If they've been coached well enough to pass for truth, it gets harder." He paused, patting the horse's neck. "What concerns me more is the document itself. Have you been able to determine anything about when it was created?" She had thought about this. "The paper looks aged, but not as old as Thomas's records from that period. The ink color is different from the ink on other things Thomas signed at the same time. Could you show that to the judge?" "I already have." He noted it but said it was not definitive proof of forgery on its own. Henry nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and she stood beside him in the afternoon light with the creek moving softly below them and the smell of autumn and horse and wood smoke all around. It was a peaceful place, she thought, despite everything. "Tell me about Thomas," Henry said unexpectedly. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to stand up in that courtroom and speak to his character as well as his land boundary, I want to understand who he was when I knew him and who he became." He glanced at her, and his expression was kind without being pitying. "And because you've been carrying this alone for 4 months, and sometimes it helps to say things out loud." She was startled enough by this that she did not deflect, which perhaps was his intention. And so she talked about Thomas. She talked about the way he had built the house himself, one room at a time, spending 2 full summers on it before he had asked her to marry him, because he said he wanted to have something real to offer her. She talked about how he had read aloud to her in the evenings from whatever books the traveling traders brought through, even books he found dull, because she loved to read and they had far too few books. She talked about how he had a laugh that came from deep in his chest and shook his whole body, and always made everyone near him start laughing too, whether they meant to or not. She talked until the creek shadow grew longer and the air began to carry the cooler edge of evening. When she stopped, she realized her eyes were wet, which embarrassed her. "I'm sorry," she said, turning slightly away. "Don't be," Henry said, with a quiet firmness that was not uncomfortable. "He sounds like a man worth grieving." She pressed the back of her hand to her eye briefly and then straightened. "He was," she said, "and that land is his. I'm not going to let Arlo Finch take it." "No," Henry agreed, and there was something in his voice that was more than polite agreement, something with actual weight to it. "You're not." She went back to the boarding house for supper, and Mrs. Pierce served beef stew and cornbread and did not ask questions, and Hazel was grateful for both. Wednesday passed with the tight, stretched quality of waiting time. She reviewed her papers again. She walked through what she intended to say. She visited Judge Aldgate once more to ask a question about the order of proceedings and came away feeling somewhat steadier. In the late afternoon, she saw Arlo Finch for the first time since all of this had begun. He was coming out of the hotel with his lawyer, Westerbrook, a sleek man in a good suit who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had won in courtrooms before. Finch himself was a broad, heavy man in his mid-50s with a thick gray mustache and the kind of easy physical authority that comes from decades of never having been seriously challenged. He wore an expensive coat and good boots, and he moved through the street like he owned it. He saw her. Their eyes met across 20 feet of dusty Main Street. He smiled, which was worse than if he had glared. It was a smile that said he expected Thursday to go his way, and he was not particularly troubled by her presence. He touched the brim of his hat and walked on. She stood still until they had turned the corner, and then she went back to the boarding house and sat at the window with Thomas's letter in her hands and reminded herself of every reason she was doing this. Thursday morning came with a high clear sky and a wind that carried the smell of the distant mountains. The courtroom was the town meeting hall, a long, narrow room with plank floors and high windows and rows of benches that had been arranged facing a heavy table at the front where Judge Aldgate would sit. By 8 in the morning, it was already half full. News traveled fast in small towns, and a dispute over land between a widow and a powerful man like Arlo Finch was the kind of thing people turned out for. Hazel arrived early, wearing her cleanest dress, a deep green wool that had been her best for years, and the same hat she wore everywhere. She sat at the table on the left side of the aisle, her satchel in front of her, her back straight, and she told herself that she was not afraid. Finch arrived with Westerbrook and 2 other men she did not recognize and occupied the table on the right side. His lawyer arranged papers with practiced efficiency. Finch himself sat back in his chair with his arms folded and his face calm, the portrait of a reasonable man who merely wanted what was owed to him. Judge Aldgate entered at 9 o'clock precisely, sat down, adjusted his glasses, and called the proceeding to order with the kind of quiet authority that settled a room immediately. It was then, just as Judge Aldgate was opening the session and asking Hazel to state her claim, that the door at the back of the meeting hall opened and Henry Rourke walked in. He had cleaned up from camp. He wore a fresh shirt and his coat was brushed and his hat was in his hand. He moved quietly along the back wall and found a place to stand, catching her eye briefly and giving a small nod. Something in her steadied completely. The judge asked her to begin. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was clear and even, "my name is Hazel Hale. I am the widow of Thomas Hale, who died in June of this year." Thomas owned and operated a ranch property of 40 acres in the Redrock Basin, a property he built from nothing over 8 years. Following his death, a man named Arlo Finch presented a document claiming Thomas owed him $820 and that the property was pledged as collateral against this debt. I am here to contest the legitimacy of that document and to request that this court reject Mr. Finch's claim on the grounds that, from the back of the room, a clear, steady voice said, "I am her witness." The room shifted. Everyone turned. Henry Rourke had not waited for the end of her sentence. He had not waited for the formal call for witnesses. He had simply spoken, standing straight and still along the back wall, his hat in both hands, his dark eyes fixed on the judge. Judge Aldgate looked over his glasses at Henry with an expression of measured interest. "And you are?" "Henry Rourke, Your Honor, ranch hand, most recently of the Crescent Bar operation east of here. I knew Thomas Hale. I have direct knowledge of a prior dispute between Thomas Hale and Arlo Finch regarding the eastern boundary of the Hale property, and I believe that history is directly relevant to the claim currently before this court." The hall was very quiet. Even Finch had shifted slightly forward in his chair, though his expression remained controlled. The judge looked at Hazel. "Was this witness known to you when you filed your response?" I found him only 2 days ago, Your Honor, but he is relevant to the matter. Thomas himself identified Mr. Rourke as a potential witness in a letter he wrote 6 years ago. The judge considered for a moment and then nodded. I'll hear from him in the appropriate order. Mr. Rourke, take a seat. Mrs. Hale, continue. Henry moved to one of the front benches and sat, and Hazel continued. She was precise and clear. She laid out the timeline. She presented the papers she had. Thomas's land deed, the tax records showing consistent ownership and payment, the county surveyor's records she had obtained showing the original plat, and Thomas's letter, the never-sent one addressed to Henry Rourke, which she offered as evidence of Thomas's own understanding of the prior dispute with Finch. Westerbrook challenged the letter sharply, calling it a private document with no legal standing. The judge allowed it as context rather than primary evidence, which was fair. Then Westerbrook presented Finch's case. He was smooth and thorough. The debt document was produced, and it was a convincing piece of paper. It bore Thomas's signature, or something that appeared to be Thomas's signature. It was dated 3 years before Thomas's death, and it was witnessed by 2 names that Hazel did not recognize. Westerbrook called the first of his witnesses, a man named Bridger, who testified that he had personally seen Thomas Hale and Arlo Finch shake hands over a loan agreement in the summer of 1880. He testified calmly and with apparent confidence and did not stumble under Hazel's few attempts to question him. She could see the judge listening carefully, and she could see the concern in his careful expression. The second witness was less convincing. He stumbled slightly on the date and then corrected himself, and when Hazel pressed him on what time of year the alleged handshake had taken place, he said summer and then said July, and then said he believed it was July. The judge made a note. Then it was Henry's turn. He came forward and stood before the judge's table with his hat held at his side and his shoulders square and his voice calm and unhurried, and the room, which had been buzzing quietly throughout the morning, went fully still. Mr. Rourke, the judge said, you state you have knowledge of a prior dispute between Thomas Hale and Arlo Finch. I do, Your Honor. In the spring of 1877, I was working on the McCaffrey Ranch south of here, when Thomas Hale asked me to ride out with him, and a county surveyor named Gates to confirm the boundary markers on the eastern line of his property. There had been a complaint filed by Arlo Finch claiming the markers had been wrongly placed, and that a strip of land including a portion of the eastern creek belonged to Finch by an older survey. And what did you find? We found that the original markers were gone. Someone had pulled them in the night and replaced them about 40 feet to the west of where they had been, effectively shifting the boundary in Finch's favor. He documented this, re-established the correct boundary with fresh stakes and the surveyor's confirmation, and filed a report with the county. Finch never pursued the matter further in any official capacity. And who, in your view, moved the original markers? I have no proof of who moved them, Henry said evenly. But Arlo Finch was the only man who stood to gain from them being where they were. Westerbrook objected to this as speculation. The judge sustained the objection but noted the context. Mr. Rourke, the judge continued, is there anything about the current claim that connects in your mind to this prior incident? Henry paused, choosing his words carefully. The pattern, Your Honor. In 1877, Arlo Finch attempted to acquire a portion of the Hale property through misrepresentation of a physical boundary. Thomas Hale successfully defended his land. Thomas Hale is now dead and cannot defend himself. What's before this court is another attempt by the same man to acquire the same property through a document that, if Mrs. Hale's account of her husband's character and their shared business practices is accurate, Thomas Hale would never have signed without her knowledge. The room exhaled. Even the benches seemed to creak with the release of held breath. Finch's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, this is character assassination based on a drifter's account of— I will have order, Judge Aldgate said, not loudly but with complete authority, and the room fell quiet again. After a brief recess and further questioning, the judge called the proceedings to a temporary halt and retired to consider the matter. He returned an hour later, and the hall filled back up again quickly, word having spread in the interim that something significant was happening. The judge set down his notes and looked over his glasses at the room. "In the matter of Finch versus the estate of Thomas Hale," he said, "this court finds the following. The document presented by Mr. Finch as evidence of debt is irregular in several respects. The signature on the document has been examined alongside known examples of Thomas Hale's signature from contemporaneous public records, and there are notable inconsistencies. The witnesses to the document have provided inconsistent accounts of the circumstances of its signing. The testimony of Mr. Henry Rourke, which this court finds credible and relevant, establishes a documented prior pattern of boundary disputes initiated by Mr. Finch against the Hale property." He paused. "This court cannot conclude beyond question that the document is a forgery, as the evidentiary threshold for such a conclusion is high. However, this court does conclude that Mr. Finch has not established the legitimacy of his claim to a sufficient legal standard. The claim is therefore denied. The property of the late Thomas Hale remains the lawful property of his widow, Hazel Hale, free of the encumbrance claimed by Mr. Finch." He struck the gavel. For a moment, Hazel simply sat very still with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and felt the words settle into her like water into dry ground. The hall erupted into noise. Someone near the back clapped and then stopped, embarrassed. People began talking and moving. Finch stood abruptly and said something sharp and low to his lawyer, who put a hand on his arm. Westerbrook's expression was carefully neutral, and then Henry Rourke was at her side, not touching her, just there, and he said quietly, "Congratulations, Mrs. Hale." She looked up at him and felt, to her absolute horror, that she was going to cry, not out of sadness, out of sheer overwhelming relief. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and then composed herself, because she was Hazel Hale and she had ridden 16 miles alone and stood in front of a circuit judge, and she was not going to weep in the Redrock Flats meeting hall. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with every part of her. "You did not have to do what you did, speaking before I had even finished. Putting yourself forward like that." Henry shook his head slightly. "You were making your case perfectly well. I just wanted Finch to know from the first moment that you were not alone." She looked at him and felt something move through her that was entirely different from grief or relief or the careful competence of the past 4 months. She looked away quickly and began gathering her papers. Outside the meeting hall, the October sun was brilliant and warm, and the town around them was in the pleasant, mild commotion of a morning's main event concluded. People nodded to her as they passed, some congratulatory, some simply acknowledging. Mrs. Pierce from the boarding house crossed the street specifically to take Hazel's hand and squeeze it. Henry stood beside her on the steps with his hat back on his head and his hands in his pockets, watching the street with the easy patience of a man accustomed to the open. "What will you do now?" Hazel asked. "I was planning to ride east and see if there's work along the river ranches for the winter," he said. She looked at him. "My property is 40 acres and I have 37 head of cattle and no ranch hand," she said. "Thomas was managing it alone, and I've been doing it alone since June, but winter is coming and there is more work than I can reasonably do by myself." He looked at her sideways, and there was a warmth in his expression that he kept carefully restrained. "Are you offering me work?" "I am offering you a fair wage, a warm bunk in the ranch hand quarters and meals," she said. "It would be entirely above board and practical." He was quiet for a moment. "I accept," he said. They left Redrock Flats the following morning. Hazel on her buckskin mare and Henry on his gray Appaloosa, riding side by side through the high autumn morning, with the red rock country opening up around them, and the sky enormous and pale blue above. They did not talk a great deal at first, comfortable in the quiet that had already developed between them, two practical people accustomed to the company of their own thoughts. But gradually, over the miles, the talk came. He told her about the years of drifting. He had grown up in Missouri, come west at 19 with the particular combination of ambition and restlessness that characterized a lot of young men in that era. Found work on cattle drives and ranches, spent a season or two in Colorado before filtering south into New Mexico territory. He had never married, not from lack of desire, he said carefully, but because the drifting life and the kind of stability a marriage required were not easily reconciled, and he had never stayed in one place long enough to build the first before attempting the second. "Did you ever want to?" she asked. "Stay in one place, I mean." He considered this with the same honest thoughtfulness he seemed to bring to everything. "I have wanted it in places," he said. Wanted it and moved on anyway, mostly because the work ran out or the situation changed. I'm older now. The road east to west and back doesn't hold the same pull it did at 20. How old are you? 32, she nodded. 4 years older than her. And you? He asked. 28, they rode on. The red rock walls rose on either side as they entered the canyon that cut toward the basin, and the horses' hooves sounded clear and rhythmic on the hard ground. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal with complete effortlessness. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said. "You can ask." "When you found out about Finch's claim, the first instinct of a lot of people in your position would have been to sell. Take whatever Finch offered and go somewhere easier. Is that a question? Why didn't you?" She looked forward between her horse's ears at the red rock country ahead, thinking about how to say it accurately. "Because Thomas built that land," she said. "He built it with his hands year by year. The house, the fence lines, the water channels. His work is in every inch of it. Selling it to the man who was trying to steal it would have been like letting that work mean nothing." She paused. "And because it is my home. It was my home before Thomas died, and it still is. I'm not going to be pushed off my own land." Henry said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "No, you're not." The Hale Ranch property came into view in the mid-afternoon. From the slight rise on the road, the buildings were visible in the flat. A modest two-room house in good repair, a barn, a smaller outbuilding that served as storage and now, presumably, would serve as Henry's quarters, and beyond it the pasture land running to the creek with the remnant herd scattered across the brown October grass. Hazel watched his face as he took it in. "It's good land," he said. "Thomas always said it had good bones." He was right. She showed him the property that afternoon, walking the fence lines, checking the cattle, pointing out what needed attention before winter arrived. She was matter-of-fact and thorough, speaking as a landowner to a ranch hand, because that was what he was and what she was, and the boundaries of that were clear and she was comfortable within them. But she noticed things. She noticed that, when one of the fence posts turned out to be rotten at the base, he did not wait to be asked but went immediately to the barn for a replacement post, and the tools needed, and had it repaired within 20 minutes, working with confident economical movements that showed he knew exactly what he was doing. She noticed that he spoke to the horses softly, and the gray Appaloosa and her buckskin had made friends quickly. She noticed that, when she pointed out the problems with the eastern water channel, which had partially silted over and needed clearing before the rains, he listened with complete attention, and then made 3 useful observations about the best approach to the clearing that she had not thought of. That evening she cooked supper in the house kitchen, a simple meal of beans and salt pork and biscuits, and she brought a plate out to the outbuilding for him. He had already made the small space livable with his bedroll and his few possessions, and he thanked her for the meal with a directness that carried no awkwardness. She went back to the house and ate alone at the table where she had eaten alone for 4 months, and the ranch around her was quiet and the fire was burning low, and she felt, for the first time, that it was a different kind of quiet than it had been. October moved through its remaining days with the unhurried clarity of autumn in the high desert. The work on the ranch fell into a rhythm. Henry was up before dawn and had the animals seen to by the time she came out in the early light. He tackled the silted water channel over 2 days of hard physical work, coming in mud-stained and tired, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who likes a problem solved. He repaired the barn roof where it had begun to leak, mended more fence, turned the remaining hay in the loft to prevent rot. They worked together well. She had expected the adjustment of having another person on the property to be more complicated than it was. Thomas had been the only man she had known well in the context of daily ranch work, and she had wondered if she would find Henry's way of doing things jarring or difficult. Instead, she found that they had similar practical sensibilities. Neither of them wasted motion, neither of them dramatized difficulty, and both of them shared a view that the work itself was its own sufficient reward when it was done well. In the evenings he sometimes came to the house for coffee. She had offered on the third day, saying simply that she made a pot each evening and it was no trouble, and he had accepted with the same direct courtesy he brought to everything. They talked, not about anything particularly momentous at first. The cattle, the weather, the condition of the fence lines, what needed to happen before the first freeze. But gradually, over the evenings and the coffee and the fire crackling low, the conversation went further. He had read widely for a man who had spent much of his adult life drifting. He carried 3 books in his saddlebag, she discovered, and could talk about history and geography with the same ease he brought to cattle management. He had opinions that were thoughtful and not reflexively conventional, and he had a particular gift for listening that she noticed more and more. The way he gave his full attention to what she was saying without performing attentiveness, without waiting visibly for his turn to speak, just genuinely listening. She found herself talking more than she had intended to. About the property, yes, but also about her own history, the years before Thomas, growing up in Kansas, the younger siblings she had helped raise after her mother's early death, the decision to come west that had led her here. She told him about the first years of her marriage, the lean ones when the ranch was being built, and money was tight enough that she had stretched every provision and every dollar with determined ingenuity. She told him about the small joys that accumulated in a good life, the particular quality of light at this latitude on winter mornings, the way the cattle moved across the pasture in the cool, the deep satisfaction of a properly put-up store of winter food. He listened to all of it, and sometimes he asked questions that showed he had been paying careful attention, and sometimes he simply sat with the information in companionable quiet. It was on an evening in mid-November, when the first cold had come down from the mountains, and the fire in the house was burning properly for warmth rather than just comfort, that something shifted between them in a way that was too clear to pretend otherwise. They had been talking about the hawk they had both watched that morning, a large red-tailed bird that had been hunting the pasture edge, and the conversation had moved from the hawk to the country generally, the way the land changed from season to season, the way this basin held the light differently than other places he had been. And then there had been a pause, a natural pause in the conversation, and they had both been looking at the fire, and she had glanced up and found him looking at her rather than the fire, and the expression on his face was entirely unguarded for one moment before he looked away. She felt the warmth of it move through her like the warmth from the fire. And she felt, simultaneously, the complicated grief of it, because what she felt was not disloyal to Thomas. She understood that Thomas had been gone 4 months and she had loved him and she would carry that love for the rest of her life, but the feeling was new and she had not expected it and she was not sure she was ready for it. She said nothing. He said nothing. The fire burned. He thanked her for the coffee and went back to the outbuilding. She sat by the fire for a long time after he left, her hands around her empty cup, thinking carefully. She did not think he was a man who would push. She was right. In the days that followed, he was exactly as he had been before, careful and capable and present. And if there was something additional in the quality of his attention toward her, it was expressed only in the quiet way he held a door or paused to ask her opinion before beginning a new project. The kind of small attentions that were easy enough to interpret as simple courtesy and equally easy to understand as something more. December arrived with a hard freeze that came one night and transformed the pasture into a glittering white sheet by morning. Hazel stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Henry move through the yard in the early frostlight, checking the stock tank to make sure it had not frozen solid, breaking the surface ice, and adding fresh water with the steady efficiency she had come to find deeply comforting. She went out to help and they worked together in the cold dawn, their breath pluming in the still air, speaking in short practical sentences about what needed doing, and she was aware of standing beside him in the particular close way that a shared task in cold air creates, almost shoulder to shoulder, and of the way he smelled of cold air and wood smoke and the wool of his coat. "Henry," she said. He looked at her. She had not planned this. She had not woken up that morning thinking today is the day, but she found the words were simply there, the way the truth often is when you stop trying to organize it. "I want you to know that I am glad you came to this ranch," she said. "Not only because of the work. I am glad for your company. I have been less alone these past 6 weeks than I have been in many months, and that matters more than I expected it to." He was quiet for a moment, holding the water bucket at his side, his eyes steady on her face. And then he said, "Hazel, I want to be straightforward with you because I think you deserve that." "Please," she said. "I came here because you needed help and because I owed Thomas a debt of respect," he said. "That's how it started. What it has become over these weeks is something quite different for me, and I am very aware that you are only recently widowed and that I am not in a position to—" "I am not a fragile thing, Henry," she said, not unkindly. He stopped. "I love Thomas," she continued. "I will love him the rest of my life in the way that a good marriage becomes a part of you. But Thomas is gone and I am here, and I am not willing to close myself against the rest of my life because grief tells me I should." She held his gaze. "I am not rushing anything. I am simply being honest with you the way you have been honest with me." He let out a slow breath, and she saw the careful containment in him release slightly. "Then I'll be honest back," he said. "I have not felt about a place the way I feel about this land in a very long time, and I have not felt about a person the way I feel about you since I can remember." The cold air was perfectly still around them. The Appaloosa was watching them from the fence with placid interest. "Then stay," Hazel said. "Not just for the winter, stay and see what this is." He looked at her for a long moment with those quiet dark eyes. "Yes," he said, "I'd like to do that." December deepened, and the winter work settled into them both in a way that was, increasingly, the work of two people building something together rather than an employer and an employee maintaining someone else's creation. Henry had a gift for the property. He saw things in it, potential in the land and the layout, and he talked about them in the evenings over coffee in a way that made her see them too. A second water channel, a better arrangement for the winter hay storage, a repair to the east pasture fence that would allow the grazing range to be extended come spring. She began to contribute her own ideas and found that he listened to them with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. They argued once or twice, briefly, about the best approach to a problem, and she discovered that arguing with him was not unpleasant. He did not bully his position through, and he did not capitulate to avoid friction. He simply talked it out until they had worked to an answer, and the answer was usually better than either of their starting positions. She told him one evening in mid-December, when the fire was high and the wind was working hard outside, and the house felt warm and sealed against the cold, that she had not thought she could feel this settled about the future. That for the past several months, the future had been a thing of dread, and now it was a thing she found herself genuinely thinking about with something close to anticipation. He was sitting across from her, his coffee cup resting on his knee, firelight moving over his face. He said, "I've spent a long time not thinking about the future at all. It's different thinking about it now." "Different how?" "Better," he said simply. She looked at him, and the warmth between them was unmistakable now, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. And she thought that there was nothing complicated about it after all. It was just two people sitting by a fire in a good house on solid land, understanding that they wanted to keep sitting there together. He leaned forward and set his cup on the table, and she did not look away, and he said her name once, quietly, and then he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand. His hand was warm and rough with work, and she turned hers in his and held it back. They sat that way for a long time, the fire burning and the wind outside and the house around them solid and good, and nothing more was said because nothing more needed to be. Christmas came to the Hale ranch quietly. Hazel had always observed it simply, a good meal and perhaps a small gift, and she did the same that year, roasting a portion of beef and making a dried apple pie and setting the table as well as she could with the good cloth she kept for occasions. Henry produced from his saddlebag a small smooth piece of turquoise stone on a thin cord that he had carried for years with no particular intent, and he placed it on the table beside her plate without ceremony, and said he thought she might like the color. She looked at it and then looked at him, and the expression on her face made him clear his throat and look at the food. She wore it around her neck from that day forward. In January, when the deep winter had settled properly and the work was reduced to maintenance, and the cold required them to stay closer to the buildings, they had more time for conversation and books and the general sedentary creativity that a cold winter imposes. Hazel had a reasonable small library, accumulated over years of trading and purchasing from traveling merchants, and Henry turned out to have strong opinions about a number of the books she owned. He read to her sometimes in the evenings as Thomas had done, and she noticed that he chose different books than Thomas would have chosen, histories and expedition accounts and scientific texts alongside the fiction, and the reading aloud became its own form of conversation, a launching point for extended discussions that sometimes went until the fire was entirely low and the candles were burning to their ends. She was falling in love with him. She knew it without drama or crisis, understood it the way you understand a change in season, not at a single precise moment but as an accumulation of evidence until the fact is simply undeniable. She loved the sound of his voice. She loved the way he thought. She loved his hands and the economy of his movements and the way he looked at the land with appreciation. She loved that he was honest with her even when honesty was not the easiest thing to be. She told him so in February, on a cold evening when the last of a storm had passed, and the world outside was swept clean, and the sky was full of stars. They had been standing in the yard looking at the stars because he had been telling her about constellations and she had wanted to see what he was describing, and somewhere in the middle of him pointing out the winter configuration of Orion, she had said, "I love you, Henry," as naturally as if she had been saying it for years. He had gone very still for a moment. Then he had turned to look at her with the full weight of those dark eyes and said, "I have loved you since the day you walked into my camp and told me you were not afraid of Arlo Finch." She laughed, which surprised them both. "I was terrified of Arlo Finch." "I know," he said. "That's what made it remarkable." He kissed her then, standing in the cold February night under a sky full of stars, and it was gentle and deliberate and entirely right. Spring came to the basin early that year, the way it sometimes does in New Mexico, arriving in March with warmth and the smell of blooming things before the last frost had fully relented. The ranch woke up with the season, and there was a great deal of work. New calves to attend, fence repairs, the planting of the small kitchen garden, the extension of the east pasture fence that they had planned through the winter. They worked it together every day, and what had been an employer and a hired hand working a property had become something unmistakably different, two people building a shared life on a shared piece of ground. The neighbors noticed. The closest neighbor, a rancher named Ed Colton who worked a property to the southwest, came by in March to check on the winter cattle losses and went away with a thoughtful expression after observing the way Henry and Hazel moved around each other in the yard. His wife, Clara Colton, came by separately a week later with a jar of preserved peaches and stayed for coffee, and was considerably less tactful about her observations, which Hazel found endearing. "He's a good man," Clara said, watching Henry through the kitchen window as he worked on the barn door that had been swelling in the moisture. "He is," Hazel said, Thomas would have liked him. Hazel thought about this. Yes, she said, I think he would have. Clara looked at her with the wise, unsentimental eye of a woman who had been married for 20 years. You're going to marry him, she said, not as a question. I think so, Hazel said. Eventually. Clara nodded approvingly and ate her biscuit. It was not many weeks later that Henry made the question official. He did not do it dramatically or ceremonially, which she would not have wanted. He did it one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the late spring light, the kind of evening where the sky stays gold for a long time and the air is exactly the right temperature, and the cattle were settled in the pasture and the world was, for the moment, undemanding. He said, I'd like to stay on this land permanently if you'll have me, not as a ranch hand, as a husband if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment, the gold light on his face and his dark eyes steady and warm. She thought of Thomas, as she sometimes did, not with grief now, but with a quiet, fond gratitude for the life she had built with him, and the land he had left her, and even, in an unexpected way, for the trouble after his death that had brought Henry Rourke to her door. Yes, she said, I'm willing. They were married in June of 1884, 1 year almost exactly from the month Thomas had died. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit minister who came through the territory twice a year, and it took place in the small church in Redrock Flats, which was attended by more people than its size strictly accommodated. Mrs. Pierce from the boarding house was there. Clyde from the livery was there. Ed and Clara Colton drove in from the Southwest property, and Clara wept with complete uninhibited satisfaction. Pete from the saloon came and stood respectfully in the back row in his best shirt. Judge Aldgate was not there, as he had long since moved on to the next circuit, but Hazel had sent him a letter after the ruling, and he had sent a brief, courteous reply saying he was glad the matter had been resolved well. She had kept that letter. Arlo Finch was not at the wedding, which went without saying. He had retreated from Redrock Flats shortly after the hearing, taking Westerbrook and his ambitions elsewhere, and the general consensus among the people of the basin was that the territory was improved by his absence. The ceremony was brief and plain and entirely sincere. When the minister asked Henry if he would take Hazel Hale as his wife, Henry said yes without hesitation and without performance, and the simplicity of it moved something in everyone present, including, visibly, Henry himself. Hazel wore the green wool dress that she had worn to the circuit court, and the turquoise stone on its cord around her neck, and when she and Henry stood together in the small crowded church, she was absolutely certain that she was in exactly the right place doing exactly the right thing. They rode home to the ranch together in the late afternoon, the two horses side by side as they had been from the beginning, and the world around them was green with spring and warm with sun and entirely peaceful. The ranch from this point forward was the Rourke property. The name changed on the deed, but the land itself changed not at all. The same red rock country, the same creek, the same 40 acres that Thomas had built from nothing. What changed was the sense of the future. Where before the future had been uncertain and something to be defended against, it was now something that both of them were turned toward with active intention. Henry's ideas for the property began to take fuller shape. The extended east pasture fence was completed in the summer, and the grazing capacity for the herd increased. He had a practical engineering sense that showed itself in small, careful improvements. A better system for managing the water channels, an adjustment to the barn that made winter hay storage more efficient, a simple shelter addition on the south side of the outbuilding that would serve as a workshop for the tools and repair work that otherwise took over the barn floor. Hazel ran the house and the accounts, and the garden with the same competent thoroughness she had always brought to them, but the distribution of work between them was fluid, and neither stood on ceremony about what fell to whom. When she needed help in the garden, he helped. When the cattle needed more management than one pair of hands could manage, she was there. They made a good team, she thought, not because they were the same, but because they were different in complementary ways. The summer moved through its hot, brilliant days. At night the desert cooled sharply and they slept with the window open to the stars, and the sounds of the night country, owls and coyotes, and the occasional movement of the cattle in the pasture. She knew she was expecting their first child in late August, and she told him on a morning when the light was very good and they were standing in the garden together, and she felt for reasons she could not have precisely explained that this was the right moment. He went very still. Then he turned to look at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that it transformed his face entirely. "Truly," he said. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms right there in the garden in the morning light with the beans growing up their poles around them, and held her with the careful strength of a man who is aware he is holding something precious. She could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, fast and strong. "When," he managed, "I believe March." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His eyes were bright. "A spring baby," he said. "That was my calculation as well." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then laughed a little, the deep laugh that she had come to love, the one that shook his whole chest. She laughed too because there was nothing else to do with so much happiness. The pregnancy moved through autumn and winter without particular difficulty. She was healthy and capable, and had no patience for being treated as an invalid, which Henry struggled with occasionally, because his instinct was to manage every heavy task himself from the moment she told him. She established early and clearly that she was fully capable of continuing her work on the ranch at reasonable capacity, and that she would tell him when she needed additional help, and he accepted this with a good humor that she appreciated. He did, however, do things like appear silently whenever she was lifting anything that weighed more than he thought appropriate, and she developed the habit of making noise so he would know where she was, which they both found amusing. The winter that year was longer than the previous one but milder in some ways. They had visitors more frequently, because the neighbors had by now accepted the Rourkes as settled fixtures of the Basin community, and the kind of social visiting that was the lifeblood of isolated ranch communities had found its rhythm. Clara Colton came often and proved to be a genuine resource regarding the pregnancy, having had 4 children herself, and approaching the subject with practical clarity that Hazel found far more useful than the vague anxieties she had been prepared to encounter. Henry read to her more that winter than before, and she noticed that his selection of books had begun to include, quietly and without announcement, things that might be useful to a person becoming a parent. She said nothing about this, because she found it too endearing to subject to commentary. In the deep winter evenings with the fire high and the land quiet under its frost, they talked about the future with a specificity and a pleasure that still sometimes surprised her, given that 18 months ago the future had been a thing of pure threat. They talked about what the ranch might become over the years, the possibility of expanding the herd when the land could support it, the long-range idea Henry had about building a second pasture structure that would give better shelter in hard winters, the garden and what she wanted to do with it in the spring. They talked about names for the child. Henry had a particular affection for names with solid weight to them, names that came from somewhere and meant something. She had opinions about syllables and what sounded right alongside Rourke. They debated with the pleasant intensity of 2 people who both care about something and know ultimately it will be a joint decision. March arrived with that early warmth again. The calves were coming and the garden wanted planting, and the basin was alive with the particular energized quality of spring in the desert when everything that had been waiting erupts at once. Their son was born on the 15th of March, 1885. He came in the early morning, with Clara Colton present to help, as she had offered months ago, and Henry in the next room, where Clara had insisted he remain, though Hazel could hear him pacing occasionally, which made her want to laugh even in circumstances that did not particularly encourage laughter. The baby was healthy and loud about it, which Clara confirmed was an excellent sign. When Henry was finally allowed into the room and Hazel put the child in his arms, the expression on his face was the twin of the one he had worn in the garden when she told him, That same unguarded, overwhelmed joy, but deeper now, given substance by the small, solid weight of the child in his hands. "He's real," Henry said, slightly awed. "He is entirely real," Hazel agreed. They named him Thomas James Rourke. Thomas for Thomas Hale because it was right, and James for Henry's father who had died when Henry was 12. The name felt like exactly what Henry had said he wanted, solid, with roots going in two directions at once. Thomas James Rourke turned out to be, from his earliest days, a child of considerable personality and absolute confidence in his own importance, which Clara said was typical of firstborn sons, and which Henry observed with a mixture of pride and mild apprehension for the years ahead. He had Hazel's green eyes and Henry's dark hair, and the particular loud certainty of a person who knows he is loved and sees no reason to be quiet about his needs. The ranch adjusted around him as ranches do, as life does, incorporating the new thing and continuing. Hazel found the adjustment of motherhood less overwhelming than she had feared and more joy-saturated than she had expected. Henry proved to be exactly the kind of father she would have predicted from everything she knew about him. Fully present, practical, not given to panic, steady as weather, and helplessly delighted by the child in ways that he did not bother to conceal. He carried Thomas James with him to the barn, narrating the work in the low, unhurried voice he usually reserved for the horses. He sat with the baby in the evenings with the same quiet patience he brought to everything, and Thomas James very early showed a clear preference for this arrangement, settling against Henry's chest with a satisfied heaviness that made Hazel's heart do something complicated and wonderful every time she saw it. The months went on. The ranch prospered in the modest way that an honest working ranch can prosper. Not dramatically, not with sudden wealth, but with the steady accumulation of good management and fair years and careful attention. The herd grew from 37 to 50 head over 2 years of careful management. The east pasture fence held through 2 hard winters. The water channels worked exactly as Henry had planned them. The basin around them changed too, in the small ways that the frontier changes. A new family settled to the north, bringing children who would eventually become Thomas James's earliest companions. A small schoolhouse was built in Redrock Flats, causing general communal satisfaction. The saloon got a new piano player who was demonstrably better than the previous one. Pete behind the bar remained, red-bearded and constant, a landmark of the territory. Hazel sometimes thought about the morning she had walked into that saloon and asked about Henry Rourke, and about the morning she had walked into the courtroom and been startled by his voice rising from the back of the room before she had even finished her opening words. She had thought, in that moment, that it was simply assistance, simply a witness coming forward to testify, nothing more complex than that. It had become the architecture of the rest of her life. She thought about Thomas too, as she always would, but with less sorrow and more gratitude as the years moved forward. Thomas had chosen good land and built a good home and loved her well, and she had lost him early, and that was a true grief and always would be. But Thomas had also, without knowing it, set in motion the chain of events that had brought Henry to her door, and there was something almost fitting in that, something that felt, when she thought about it in the quiet evenings, like the landscape of a life having its own particular logic that is not always visible from within the middle of it. In the autumn of 1886, when Thomas James was a year and a half old and had discovered the joyful fact of walking and was applying this discovery to every square foot of the ranch he could reach, Hazel found herself expecting their second child. She told Henry in the same garden where she had told him the first time, and his reaction was fundamentally the same, the stillness and then the brightness, though this time he did not look quite as stunned. "You're not surprised," she observed. "I'm always surprised," he said. "I'm also always glad." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887. She was quieter than her brother had been, which was a relative statement as Thomas James had established a very high baseline for volume. And she had Henry's dark eyes and Hazel's auburn hair, and a watchful, interested quality from her very earliest days that made Henry say she was thinking very hard about the world and simply choosing not to report her conclusions yet. They named her Eleanor Ruth Rourke, Eleanor because Hazel had always loved the name, and Ruth for Hazel's mother who had died young and been thought of often. Thomas James regarded Eleanor with a mixture of deep proprietorial affection and occasional alarm at the disruptions she introduced to his established order, and then settled, over weeks, into the role of older brother with a seriousness that was both endearing and faintly comical in a child who was not yet two. The ranch at this point was genuinely full of life. Children and animals, and the daily productive noise of a working property being managed by two people who knew it down to the last fence post. In the evenings, after the children were settled, Hazel and Henry sat on the porch or by the fire as they had from the beginning, and the quality of those evenings had accumulated texture over the years, had grown layered with the history of everything they had built together. He still read to her. She still argued with him about the best approach to any number of ranch problems and was still right about half the time, and acknowledged this with honesty. She still wore the turquoise stone on its cord, worn smooth now from years against her skin. He still had that quality of full attention when she spoke, that gift of genuine listening, and she thought sometimes that it was one of the things she had first noticed about him, and one of the things she was most certain she would notice when she was 70. It was on one such evening, the children asleep in the ranch quiet around them and the October sky enormous and starred overhead, that Henry said, unprompted, "Do you remember the hearing?" "I think about it often," she said. "I almost didn't come." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I arrived in Redrock Flats 3 days before you did, and I knew the circuit court was sitting. I had been at the Crescent Bar all summer, and I had some business I'd been thinking about attending to further east." He was quiet for a moment. "Something made me stay. I can't tell you exactly what, but when the word got around town that there was a widow challenging Arlo Finch in the circuit court, I paid attention, and when I heard the name Hale, I remembered Thomas. You didn't know it was his widow. Not until you came into my camp." He looked at the sky. "But I had decided before that morning that I would go to the hearing and listen. I had decided that, if Thomas Hale's name was connected to something unjust, I would say what I knew." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the full weight of that coincidence, the nearness of a different outcome. "And then I walked into your camp," she said. "And then you walked into my camp," he confirmed, "and asked me very directly for help and looked at me like you expected the answer to be yes. I was hoping the answer would be yes." "I know," he said, smiling. "I could tell the difference." She reached across and took his hand, the way she often did, and he held hers in both of his, the way he often did, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the horses were still in the pasture, and the children were asleep inside, and the ranch sat solid and real on its 40 acres of good New Mexico ground. In the following years, the Rourke Ranch grew by degrees. Henry bought an adjacent 10 acres from a neighbor who was moving on, adding to their eastern boundary and giving them the creek access Thomas had always wanted but had not quite reached. The herd topped 60 head for the first time in the spring of 1889, a milestone they celebrated with considerable satisfaction. Thomas James started at the Redrock Flats schoolhouse and proved to be, to no one's particular surprise, an opinionated and engaged student who had strong feelings about everything the teacher said and expressed them frequently. Eleanor grew into herself at her own pace, that thoughtful, watchful child becoming a thoughtful, watchful girl who had a particular connection to the animals of the ranch, and who could often be found sitting entirely still near the horses or the calves with a patience that exceeded her brother's considerably. She had a gift, Henry said once, for simply being present without demanding anything, which was a rare quality. Hazel taught both children everything she knew about the land, the names of the plants that grew in the basin, the behavior of the sky before weather, the proper care of an animal, the keeping of accounts. Henry taught them to ride, and Thomas James took to it with immediate bold enthusiasm, while Eleanor learned with methodical precision, and then quietly surpassed her brother in the quality of her horsemanship within a year of learning. The wider world continued to be what it was. The territory was changing, as territories do in this period, pressed by the forces of settlement and commerce, and the long, often unjust machinery of expansion that was transforming the West. Hazel and Henry were not unaware of this. They could see, in the growth of Redrock Flats from a raw settlement to a more established small town, and in the new roads being surveyed and the new telegraph line that came through in 1888, that the frontier quality of the country was shifting. They were part of that shifting, as all settlers were, and they did not pretend otherwise. What they built with the intention of permanence. Not because permanence was guaranteed in any human life, but because the alternative was to hold everything loosely and at arm's length, and neither of them was built for that. The house had grown too, by practical degrees. Henry added a second bedroom in 1887 before Eleanor arrived, and then a proper back porch in 1889, and then a small study off the main room where Hazel kept the accounts and the books, and where she had gradually accumulated a genuinely substantial library by the standards of the basin, trading and purchasing whenever the opportunity arose. She sat in that study sometimes in the winter evenings, with the lamp burning and the sounds of the house around her, Henry's voice from the main room where he was reading something to the children, Eleanor's soft questions and Thomas James's louder ones, the fire crackling and the wind at the windows, and she felt the full good weight of everything. There had been a morning, 6 years and more ago now, when she had stood in a narrow boarding-house room with a leather satchel and a legal problem and no certainty about anything. There had been a courtroom where a voice had spoken from the back row before she had finished her opening words, a voice that had cut through the careful weight of fear and uncertainty, and said plainly, "I am her witness." He was still her witness, in every sense the phrase could carry. By the early 1890s, the Rourke Ranch was considered one of the solid, well-run properties of the Redrock Basin, the kind of ranch that other people in the region pointed to as an example of what good management and honest labor could produce. Henry had developed a local reputation not only as a capable rancher, but as a man whose judgment on land and cattle questions was worth consulting, and neighbors came to him occasionally with questions or disputes, and he addressed them with the same careful fairness he had always brought to things. Hazel had by this point taken on a more formal role in the small community. She served on the committee that managed the schoolhouse funds and contributed significantly to the establishment of the small lending library that the school accumulated over years of donated books and purchased volumes. She had a particular insistence that the library include materials that were actually useful to people's daily lives alongside the novels and the histories, practical books about farming and animal care and medicine and cooking, the knowledge that had always been distributed woman to woman, and that she thought deserved to be more permanently preserved. Thomas James, at 8, was already a constant presence around the ranch work, and had declared with complete confidence that he intended to run the biggest cattle operation in the territory when he was grown. Henry received this announcement with a straight face and told him that was a fine ambition, and perhaps he might start by cleaning the barn thoroughly, which Thomas James did with competitive intensity. Eleanor, at 7, had no such declarations. She helped with everything asked of her and seemed equally engaged by all of it, but her deepest pleasure remained the horses, and Henry had given her sole responsibility for the gray Appaloosa, his horse from the years of drifting, who was now considerably older and considerably more calm, and Eleanor groomed him every day with a dedication that was entirely her own and owed nothing to parental encouragement. The gray horse, Henry said, had better manners now than he had in his working years, and seemed to have accepted his position as Eleanor Rourke's personal charge with the satisfied resignation of an animal that knows itself to be in good hands. The children grew alongside the seasons and the ranch, and each year added more to the life that Henry and Hazel had built from those first uncertain months. More memory, more history, more of the layered texture that a place accumulates when it is genuinely lived in and genuinely loved. There came a winter evening in 1892, when the house was full in the particular way that it only was at Christmas. The smell of the food Hazel had been cooking for 2 days, the tree that Thomas James and Eleanor had helped cut from the ridge and decorate with the modest accumulated collection of ornaments that had grown over the years, the children's voices and Henry's and the fire and the lamp, and the cold pressing at the windows making everything inside feel more vivid and real. After the children were asleep, Hazel and Henry sat by the fire in the easy silence they had always been able to inhabit together, and he reached over and touched the turquoise stone at her throat, the small stone from the saddlebag he had been carrying for years before he had known there was someone to give it to. "It's worn smooth," he said. "Everything that gets used properly wears smooth," she said. He smiled at that. He looked at her with those dark eyes and the firelight on his face and 9 years of building together between them and the children asleep down the hall, and he said, "Hazel, I want you to know something. Tell me. Everything I have that is worth having began the morning you walked into my camp with your leather satchel and your green eyes and asked me to testify." She looked at him steadily. "I would say everything I have that is worth having began the moment you stood up in that courtroom before I had even finished speaking," she said, "though I am also counting the 40 acres. He laughed, the deep full laugh, and she laughed too, and the fire burned between them and the house was warm and solid around them, and the ranch was at rest under the winter stars, all of it real and grounded and theirs. She thought, in the peaceful quiet that followed, about everything that had moved through these years. The grief of losing Thomas and the long hard months that followed. The 16-mile ride to Redrock Flats with a satchel full of papers and a name written in a dead man's unsent letter. The cold calculation of Arlo Finch and the patient authority of Judge Aldgate, and the moment in the back of that meeting hall when a voice had risen clear and certain before she had finished her first sentence. The walk to the creek camp, the gray Appaloosa in the cottonwood shade, the dark eyes of a man she had not known, and the decision he had made already before she arrived to stand for what was right. Every conversation by the fire, every mile ridden side by side. The garden in the morning light and the stars over the yard and the turquoise stone on its cord. Thomas James and Eleanor growing up in a house full of work and love and books and horses. The ranch with its 40 acres, now 50, now more, built up by 2 pairs of hands where one had worked alone before. All of it beginning with a widow who would not be moved from what was hers, and a cowboy in the back of a courtroom who had not waited to be asked. Outside, the territory was enormous and cold and indifferent, as it had always been. But inside the Rourke house on the Redrock Basin, the fire burned, and Henry reached over and took her hand, and the life they had made together was complete and warm and entirely real, as solid and enduring as the good red land beneath their feet, and neither of them would have had it any other way.